As India's Prime Minister kicks off the first leg of his European tour, we'll be looking at what he has achieved so far and what he still hopes for in the future. And the case of two women charged with the killing in Malaysia of the DPRK leader's half-brother has been transferred to a higher court. But are they, as some fear, being made scapegoats for the real culprits? Welcome to The Point. I'm Liu Xin. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi is in Germany, and a number of agreements and declarations of intent have been signed between the two countries. A total of €1 billion will go into cooperation projects in science and technology and the startup world. This is what Mr. Modi has achieved so far on the first leg of his European trip. Before his visit, Modi described it as a new chapter in Indian-German ties. Has Modi met his target? And additionally, is Modi's charm of offensive likely to be at odds with China's Belt and Road Initiative, which seeks to connect Asia and Europe through infrastructure and trade? I'm pleased to be joined today in New Delhi by TCA Rangachari, former Indian ambassador to Germany, France and Algeria, and in our Beijing studio by Professor Ye Hailing, director of the Center for South Asia Studies with the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Welcome to the gentlemen. Now, Ambassador Rangachari, let me come to you first. What do you think is the significance of Mr. Modi's trip this time, not just to Germany, but also to Spain and some other countries?
Good evening. This trip of Prime Minister Modi to several European countries, Germany, Spain, France, and also a visit to Russia, is important partly in itself and partly in a larger global context. If I go to the latter first, President Trump has just been in Europe, and in the course of the last several months there have been indications about international agreements being called into question. There have also been some questions in regard to protectionism, and therefore a country like India, which is a growing economy, currently the IMF estimates are that it might grow this year at somewhere between 7 to 7.5%. and an economy which has just overtaken Britain, so it becomes the 5th largest economy in the world. As far as Germany is concerned, the Indo-German relations are concerned, these have traditionally been very friendly. They have been very close over a long period of time. Germany is one of the major investors and largest trading partner in the European Union for India. And while the Indo-German trade doesn't quite compare to the China-Germany trade, at the same time, it is important both for Germany as well as India to keep this relationship going, both on the political as well as on the economic front. Plus, of course, education, science and technology, and a variety of other areas in which Germany and India have cooperated with each other. So I would see the importance of this visit partly in the bilateral context, partly in a larger global context, where soon the Chinese Prime Minister, I think beginning tomorrow, will be in Germany. India and China are also close partners, both economically as well as politically. And in the context of both having emerged as major economies in the world, I think it is a signal that with the European Union, with Germany itself, which is the largest member of the European Union, the two countries, the Asian giants, if I may say so, are working together in order to step in where there are gaps because of changes that have taken place elsewhere in the world.
Professor Ye, what is your take on the significance of Mr. Modi's visit to Europe and to Russia this time?
I think for President Modi, it's a very important visit to Europe because it's the time to test his theory on the domestic development, especially on the economy issue. We all know Premier Modi's theory is quite different with the then Premier Manmohan Singh. Manmohan Singh preferred the Indians' economy rising should rely on his domestic market, but Premier Modi more prefer the international cooperation, and this time to engage with Europe will lay a very consolidated foundation for India and Europe to launch their multilateral cooperation and boost Indians' external-oriented economy. And so in this context, I think this is very significant, but we need time to verify what's the actual achievement made by this visit. Especially, we also hear that on the FTA negotiation, didn't go very smoothly.
Let's talk about the FTA in just a moment, but first let me bring you a short soundbite from what Mr. Modi said during a joint press conference with his host Angela Merkel. Here it is.
I think the importance of partnership is of course beneficial for not only the two countries that are involved, but also this partnership, I feel, is something that we have always given consideration to make sure it is useful in the global context.
Ambassador Rangachari, how do you read into Mr. Modi's words? Why do you think he's there to emphasize the global context of the bilateral relationship between India and Germany?
Well, there have been many changes that have taken place in the recent past, as I mentioned earlier. I mean, as far as the European Union is concerned, the decision taken in Britain to leave the European Union was a major blow. It was not expected. It was not expected in the European Union. It was unexpected insofar as Britain itself was concerned. The Prime Minister, who was David Cameron, resigned precisely because of that. And the negotiations for Britain to leave European Union have just about to commence, and they're going to take a certain period of time. Therefore, within Europe, given the economic difficulties, because the rates of growth are still only hovering around 1%, and the forecast for current year as well as next year is not very much more than that. At the same time, there are political issues, as I mentioned just now, Brexit. So, and then when you read it together with the visit of President Donald Trump of the United States to Europe, where there was a great deal of disappointment in regard to the decision of the United States on protectionism, on the issue of climate change agreement, Paris 2015 and so on. I think both India as well as Germany are looking, as I'm sure the Chinese Prime Minister, when he goes to Germany later this week, will be doing, are looking to see how countries like Germany, India, China can work together in order to step into the breach and try and make sure that the economic and political evolution remains stable. And I think it is in that context that we should look at the statement that the Prime Minister made of global developments and importance and relevance in the global context.
Professor Ye, now a lot of people are saying the fact that the Western camp is seeing some split, in their opinion, especially after what Angela Merkel said about the United States and UK, there is an opening of greater opportunity, of greater role to be played by countries from outside of Europe, namely China, and obviously India seems also to want to get in there and raise its international profile. How do you read into Mr. Modi's statement just now?
Of course, we should admit that India's role in the global economy is rising very rapidly. Actually, the European EU is still the largest economy in the world, and the Indian record the fastest growth last year in the whole world, measured by the big economy, not the small one. So in this case, I think India's cooperation with Europe will lay a very good foundation for the world global economy to stabilize the world economy. But we also need notice the one essential effect that the Indian economy is still domestic market oriented. So India's role for the globalization in the context of the economy issue is not as large as Europe, US or China. So it represents the future is very bright, but not necessarily reflect current reality. But I think since India was accelerate its domestic economy development, also try to strengthen the linkage with the international market, this role between the Indian and Europe cooperation will be played a more important and positive role in the future.
Briefly, Professor Ye, is that also the reason why the free trade agreement talks between Europe and India has been stalled? Briefly, please.
I don't think this is only between the India and Europe. It's a global, worldwide phenomenon. Actually, free trade now it seems that it's already lost its attraction compared with the past years. So we need some new thinking. Try to stabilize the world economy order, but not only signed by the signed bilateral FTA.
Well, Ambassador Rangachari, now you were mentioning Chinese Premier Li Keqiang's visit, which really it seems to be a coincidence that the two would be coinciding their visit to Germany at this particular moment. And when we talk about India, we cannot ignore the fact that India or the Indian government or the Indian press have been quite skeptical of the One Belt, One Road initiative that China has been trying to promote. What kind of potential cooperation do you think India and China can have, or really is there, just downright competition between the two sides?
Well, one quick word insofar as the FTA is concerned. This FTA actually has become, is under negotiation with the European Union, and hopefully some of the issues that have been flagged on either side, as far as the Indian side is concerned, free movement in terms of labor and professionals and so on, that is an issue. And as far as the European side is concerned, they would like to have guarantees across the board on a number of issues. Now, therefore, the process of negotiation is on, and hopefully it will come through in a not distant future. Insofar as India and China is concerned, if we work backwards, current projections are that in the course of the next 10 to 15 years, China would become either the number one, it is already the number two economy. India would also be probably the number third economy. And therefore, for two large economies to work together with the European Union, which is currently the largest, makes a great deal of sense, both for stability and for prosperity, not just in our region, that is the Asian region, but also insofar as the European Union, as far as Europe and global economy is concerned. I think that is how we should look at this. Even if the visit happens to be coincidental, the interests are more long-lasting.
Thank you very much. We have to leave it there. That was TCA Rangachari, former Indian ambassador, and Professor Ye Hailing, director of the Center for South Asia Studies with the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. And as usual, here is my point. Now, it's very clear that Prime Minister Modi's intention is to wow European investors and increase India's international profile against what could be seen as the shadow of China's economic growth. Competition is not a bad thing, as it provides an incentive to do better to stay ahead, but is it a wise thing to compete simply because of cynicism? Now, the answer is probably no. Mr. Modi takes pride in the democratic values his country shares with Germany, before and among other things. But from the example of Ms. Merkel's disappointment with the US and UK, shared values are not the guarantee of good political ties, even less so for good business relations. For India to step up considerably its trade with foreign countries, a lot of effort would be needed. To have an open mind might be a helpful first step. Now, the case of two women charged with killing the estranged half-brother of the DPRK leader was transferred to a higher court in Malaysia on Tuesday. Indonesian Siti Aisyah and Doan Thi Huong from Vietnam are likely to have their first hearing within a month. Both could face the death sentence if convicted of murdering Kim Jong Nam at Kuala Lumpur airport on February the 13th. Malaysian police said 4 DPRK suspects fled the country on the day of the attack, and another 3 suspects were allowed to return to Pyongyang in March as part of a swap deal with the DPRK. Defense lawyers have said they fear the 2 women, being the only suspects arrested, will become scapegoats for the real culprits. What's special about this case, and how could it influence possibly the relations between Kuala Lumpur and Pyongyang? I'm happy to be joined from Singapore by Dr. Ai Soon Ho, an adjunct senior fellow at Nanyang Technological University, and in Beijing Mr. Yang Xiyu, a senior research fellow at the China Institute of International Studies. But first, a quick look at the timeline of what happened.
On February the 13th, 2017, Kim Jong Nam was attacked by 2 women at Kuala Lumpur International Airport in Malaysia during his return trip to Macau. He was later transferred to the hospital but died en route. On February the 15th, Malaysian police arrested a woman suspect holding a Vietnamese passport, Doan Thi Huong, who was identified through CCTV footage. 1 day later, a 25-year-old Indonesian woman named Siti Aisyah was arrested and identified as the second female suspect. 4 other suspects fled Malaysia on the day of the killing. On the 10th of March, police completed the autopsy, confirming that the body belonged to Kim Jong Nam, based on a DNA sample provided by his son, Kim Jong Nam. Relations between Kuala Lumpur and Pyongyang have been deteriorating ever since, with the DPRK dispatching a high-level delegation to Malaysia and Malaysia cancelling visa-free entry for travellers from the DPRK. Then on the 30th of March, the two sides made a deal. 3 suspects were allowed to go home, along with the body of Kim Jong Nam, as part of a swap deal with the DPRK, which had banned 9 Malaysians from leaving. The 2 female suspects have been charged with murder. After 2 hearings at a local court, the case was transferred to the High Court, where they are likely to make their first appearance within a month.
Indeed, a very intriguing case. Now, Dr. O, let me come to you first. The chief lawyer for one of the arrested suspects and state prosecutors said that they have yet to be given the defense and the closed-circuit TV footage of the assassination or the autopsy report on Kim Jong Nam. Is that a real disadvantage for the defense of the 2 suspects?
Well, I think in a case like that, indeed, this information should be given to the lawyers for the 2 defense, for the 2 accused in this case. But I think also because it involves, for example, the diplomatic intrigues between 2 countries, Malaysia and North Korea. Sometimes, for example, the Malaysian authorities may be slightly hesitant in providing this information. But since many of these information pieces have been available quite publicly, I think it's a matter of time before the Malaysian authorities will be providing the lawyers for the 2 accused of this information. I don't think the Malaysian authorities will be deliberately try to deprive them of this information, because if the Malaysian authorities were to do so, then if they were convicted, those would be, for example, grounds for appeal to higher courts. Yeah.
Mr. Yang, now, if convicted, the 2 suspects could face death penalty, as I mentioned. Some say they are being scapegoats for the real culprits because, you know, the other suspects are nowhere to be found at this moment. Do you think the eventual verdict could be fair?
I think that will be very, very difficult decision for by the higher court in Malaysia, simply because that's not a pure legal case, but involved heavily in diplomatic, political relations between Kuala Lumpur and Pyongyang, even between Kuala Lumpur and Jakarta and Hanoi, because of the 2 suspects hold different nationalities. However, I'm sure the result of the sentence will be very negative to the 2 suspects based on the already existed evidences.
For instance, are you talking about the suspected use of the nerve gas that a lot of people say have been found on the body of Kim Jong Nam?
Well, it's a quite controversial issue. Now, all the information released by Malaysia authorities say the agent was VX. But DPRK has provided very strong argumentation against this conclusion. So before the authority of Malaysia provided the further evidences to support what they said previously, I think that the disputes will continue, even between the lawyer for the defensive lawyer and the court will have a very serious debates about the evidences, about the results, about the suspect's involvement, the degree of the involvement, and so on. So in short, further evidences are desperately needed by all both of the sides.
Dr. O, do you share Mr. Young's view? And also, it is quite interesting to see the 3 DPRK suspects being allowed to go back to the DPRK as part of a swap deal with the DPRK. How important are they in deciding the outcome of the case, in the fair trial of the case?
Well, I agree partially with my colleague from Beijing in the sense that these two suspects from Vietnam and from Indonesia, they were caught sort of red-handed by CCTV footages of smearing some sort of chemicals on Mr. Kim Jong Nam, and apparently Mr. Kim Jong Nam died as a result of that. Well, but then on the other hand, number one, you have to establish that Mr. Kim indeed died of those chemicals which they smear on his face. And number two, their contention, the arguments of the two accused is that they thought that it was a so-called prank. They thought that they were trying to sort of make fun of Mr. Kim, trying to surprise him with a birthday wish or something. And apparently previously they had practiced with their controllers or handlers, but under the impression that they were about to give a birthday surprise to Mr. Kim Jong Nam. So, and if that is the case, if the court accepts that, then there's no murder case. There may be a case of so-called manslaughter, namely with a lower level of the intent to kill. Namely, for example, they were playing some prank, but unfortunately the victim died of those pranks. Then they would not be sentenced to death, they will be sentenced to a number of years. But that is something in the future. But my guess, based on my own legal training, would be you'll be reduced to a manslaughter charge. As to the sort of the so-called swapping of the three North Korean suspects,
Well, we seem to have lost the line there. We might hope to re-establish the line, but let's come back to Mr. Yang here in Beijing. Why do you think the three suspects were able to return to the DPRK so quickly, given the importance of their role in deciding exactly what happened in this case, Mr. Yang?
Well, that is compromise between Kuala Lumpur and Pyongyang based on the humanitarian purposes, because at that time the two capitals engaged in war involving 9 citizens of Malaysia in Pyongyang and 3 in Kuala Lumpur, 3 North Koreans in Kuala Lumpur. And the 9 Muslim Malaysian citizens were suffered from the inconvenient food provisions and other reasons. So they desperately need to return to their homeland. So under that consideration, Malaysia made a very quick decision to compromise with Pyongyang. So the deal was made in a very short term. But for Malaysia, I think the deal was very good for Pyongyang because they got all they want to back. But for Malaysia, they lost some possible base for the possible evidences. But I really suspect that the 3 suspects returning to North Korea will be, to some degree, be involved in the upcoming court.
You don't think so?
No. I'm sorry. Yes, I do believe the 3 suspects, although not in Malaysia, will be to some degree involved in the court.
Is it possible for them to be sent back to
no,
Malaysia?
No.
It's absolutely not possible.
No possibility to let them back to the court, but the case will involve the 3 suspects' names, or maybe some roles, and so on. So that case in the court will be very, very complicated.
Yes. In fact, before they went back to the DPRK, they were given, they gave some interviews, right, to the Malaysian authority before they went. So possibly these interviews could be used against them. What about the 4 other people that fled the country right after the incident? How could their role be investigated, and how could, if they, broke the law, how could they be brought to justice?
I think that would be a very big question. If the video records has no direct indicators indicating the 4 suspects involved in the activities, I don't think Malaysia authorities will put all of the 4 into the court. However, if the case is the opposite, say they have a direct, clear video showing some involvements, then the 4 suspects, maybe plus the other 3 will be involved in the court. It's up to basically it's up to the evidences Malaysia authority has got.
Yeah, well, it's very difficult to find out then exactly what happened, because obviously these 2 ladies are not able to mastermind and conduct something as complicated as that. But one sentence maybe to how is this going to affect the relationship between Malaysia and the DPRK, very quickly.
No matter what the result of the court, the relationship between the 2 countries will be deteriorated than before.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Yang Xiyu from the China Institute of International Studies, and Mr. and Dr. Ae-Soon Oh from the Nanyang Technological University. And as usual, here is my last point. Now, it's definitely too early to tell to what degree and in what way these 2 suspects have been involved. These 2 female suspects have been involved in the killing of whom the Malaysian government has identified as Kim Jong Nam, the estranged half-brother of Kim Jong Un. They might have been aware of what they were doing, or they might have been tricked into the whole thing. What is certain is they alone couldn't have carried it out. Having grown up in impoverished rural regions of their respective countries, they were making a humble living by doing small jobs, possibly even as sex workers. To use an internationally prohibited chemical weapon to kill is definitely not something that they could have masterminded or executed alone and successfully. As we know, 4 male suspects fled immediately and 3 others were handed back to authorities in the DPRK. Until and unless these people's role in the crime is found out, it will remain a mystery as to what really happened. And for now, these 2 female suspects could find themselves alone in facing harsh legal consequences of their actions and being in the international spotlight. That's all for this edition of The Point. As always, follow me on Twitter or visit our Facebook page using the handle The Point with LX. Download the application called CGTN Live to watch our show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. I'm Lu Xing, and you've got The Point.